Okay, lecture number 15. As I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, get your pen out and get ready to take some notes. And again, try to learn the hormonal control of the ovarian and uterine cycles. Later we'll be talking about that. It's pretty complex. And so you really want to try to learn it as a step-by-step process or story that'll help you understand it better than if you're just trying to memorize everything as a set of words and definitions. That's probably not going to work. So as we've talked about already, the ovarian cycle consists of two major phases. The follicular phase, which refers to changes in the follicles that are occurring, also changes in the oocyte that is housed inside a follicle. Ovulation around day 14, midpoint of the cycle, that's where the secondary oocyte pops out of the ovary and into a fallopian tube. And then the second half is called the luteal phase. Luteal is referring to the corpus luteum, which is created from the leftover granulosa and theca cells of a mature follicle. And that becomes a little miniature endocrine organ that produces estrogen and progesterone, very necessary to maintain the inner lining of the uterus and to make it suitable to support an embryo if it implants. If no pregnancy happens, the corpus luteum starts degenerating after about 10 days after ovulation, and it will shrivel up and die and become the corpus albicans, which is essentially a little piece of scar tissue in the ovary. Okay, so what hormones are going to be involved in establishing and controlling this ovarian cycle? So several of them are the same ones that are involved in the male. We've got GnRH again, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is secreted by the hypothalamus, travels down to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary secretes FSH and LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and that name makes a little more sense in the female than the male since we're talking about these ovarian follicles. And then LH stands for luteinizing hormone. And if you remember, in the male, luteinizing hormone stimulates the interstitial cells in the testes to secrete testosterone. And follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the sustanacular cells in the seminiferous tubules to produce androgen binding protein, or ABP. So these hormones are going to have different functions on the ovaries, as we'll see as we go through the story here. During childhood, before a female reaches puberty, the ovaries are growing, and they do secrete small amounts of estrogens. And again, estrogen can be used plurally because there are different types of estrogen that are a little bit chemically different from each other. And those exert some negative feedback on the hypothalamus. So they inhibit hypothalamic release of GnRH. All right, if you don't have any GnRH, there's going to be no stimulation of FSH and LH secretion. You got to have FSH and LH secretion to start the maturation of the follicles and the oocytes and so forth as part of the ovarian cycle. Okay, when a female nears puberty, that's when the hypothalamus starts secreting GnRH. That leads to FSH and LH secretion, and these act on the ovaries. And takes about 3 years for regular ovarian cycles to develop, and all or almost all actually result in ovulation. Menarche refers to the first menstrual period. So, but again, it'll take about 3 years for these cycles, on average, to become regular. Of course, that varies from female to female. Some females never have completely regular menstrual cycles. There are a lot of factors and individual differences involved in this. Okay, some hormonal interactions during a 28-day cycle. So again, GnRH from the hypothalamus travels down to the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary secretes FSH and LH. And FSH and LH, what they do is FSH promotes the growth of several follicles. So the follicles start maturing from primordial to primary to secondary. And also it's stimulating estrogen release. So LH is involved in that as well. So just like LH was stimulating testosterone release in the male, it's involved in estrogen release in the females. Then we have negative feedback, just like we saw in the males. So as estrogen levels go up, they increase. Estrogen travels through the blood, and it's going to have negative feedback on production of FSH and LH. So that's much the same as we saw with testosterone in the male. And again, that's going to keep estrogen levels within a homeostatic range, and it also allows an actual monthly cycle to be established. It allows these fluctuations to take place. Also, we'll see that inhibin, remember we had that in the male as well, that inhibits FSH release from the anterior pituitary in the male, and that also happens in a female as well. So let's take a look at what's going on here on this series of slides which correspond to figure 2721 in your textbook. All right, so the first one here, we've got our GnRH being secreted by the hypothalamus. That travels through the blood vessels and the little stalk, which, if you remember, that's also called the infundibulum. We have an infundibulum on the fallopian tube, and there's an infundibulum also that connects the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Acts on these cells in the anterior pituitary, tells them, hey, start secreting some FSH and LH. So those get secreted, those enter the blood. Targets are in the ovaries. All right, so we can see FSH is going to act on the follicles located in the ovaries. And so it's stimulating those to increase in size, to grow, develop, mature. And if you notice here also, LH acts on the thecal cells. So those are cells within the connective tissue coverings of the secondary oocytes, the more mature types of secondary oocytes. And this is kind of interesting. They actually produce androgens, male sex hormones, and then the granulosa cells convert androgens to estrogens. All right, so they have enzymes that take these male sex hormones and convert them over to estrogens. So that's pretty interesting. A couple of different steps that have to take place there. And also notice the granulosa cells here produce inhibin, which is going to, that's an inhibitory hormone. It's going to have negative feedback inhibition on production of FSH. Okay, and then so what's happening here now? We've stimulated these granulosa cells to make estrogens, and these estrogens actually act on the follicles themselves and stimulate them to continue their maturation processes. So you need these increased estrogens to actually develop a mature vesicular follicle each month in one of the two ovaries. Okay, then we got our dashed lines over here on the diagram. Okay, so notice as estrogen levels are going up, you have negative feedback inhibition on GnRH, FSH, and LH production, and also the inhibin made by the granulosa cells inhibits the release of those hormones as well. So that's your negative feedback. Okay, then something interesting, what actually triggers ovulation? Why all of a sudden does the primary oocyte become a secondary oocyte and it's able to break out of that mature follicle and break through the wall of the ovary? So your estrogen levels, if you think about it, you've got this FSH and this LH that's stimulating more and more and more estrogen production. So your estrogen levels keep going up, and eventually they get to the point where instead of inhibiting LH and FSH release, briefly there is a positive feedback that occurs, and stored LH, luteinizing hormone, and some FSH is suddenly released in a burst. So you have a burst of secretion. All right, so you've got cells in the anterior pituitary that are storing LH and FSH, and when the estrogen levels reach a certain point, right in the middle of the ovarian cycle, that stimulates this big burst of luteinizing hormone, and that's the signal that triggers ovulation. So the mature follicle breaks open, and the primary oocyte in there completes meiosis 1, becomes a secondary oocyte, and that secondary oocyte is able to ovulate and be released. All right, and that's depicted here on this part of the diagram. Estrogen levels keep going up, keep going up, keep going up, and at mid-cycle, you reach a point where suddenly you have positive feedback against the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and that triggers this LH surge. If you actually look, your textbook has graphs that show you the levels of FSH and LH along a typical ovarian cycle, and if you look right in the middle, you get a bump of LH and FSH secretion, so they both go up a little bit, but it's really the LH surge that stimulates ovulation. And that's what we're seeing here on this part of the diagram. That LH surge, step number 4, causes the mature follicle to rupture, and ovulation occurs. There's our secondary oocyte that's popping into the uterine tube, and it's surrounded by its zona pellucida and corona radiata. And now we're going to enter the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. These leftover cells, these leftover granulosa and theca cells that we've talked about before, they become the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum is going to secrete progesterone and estrogen. And that begins almost immediately. After ovulation, you do have, all right, so you have estrogen levels do this. They go up, they go up, they go up. At ovulation, they drop back down, but then they start coming up again during the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle because the corpus luteum is going to be producing estrogen. Progesterone is a very important hormone of the corpus luteum, and again, because that's going to help maintain the endometrial lining of the uterus. So progesterone does some other things as well, but it suppresses uterine contractions. So, and if a pregnancy occurs, so if a sperm fertilizes a secondary oocyte, takes about a week before that developing embryo actually implants along the inside lining of the uterus. So you better not go through menstruation and slough off the endometrial lining. If you do, then the embryo is not going to have a nice, healthy endometrial lining to attach to when it arrives in the uterus. All right, we have some additional negative feedback that's going on here. All right, so your corpus luteum here is producing progesterone and estrogen, and those get into the blood. That's why it says plasma, progesterone and estrogen. And those exert negative feedback on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus as well. So you have decreased LH and FSH. And also you have inhibin from the corpus luteum as well, enhancing the negative feedback of progesterone and estrogen. And why do we need this happening? Let's say an egg has become fertilized. Ideally, in a female, you have one embryo that implants, you have one developing fetus in the womb at a time and not multiples. If LH and FSH were not suppressed by negative feedback, they could be stimulating additional ovulation to take place. So you could have an egg that gets fertilized by a sperm, and then maybe a week later, out pops another secondary oocyte from an ovary, and it gets fertilized, and so you've got another pregnancy that's starting, a week or a week and a half behind another. So that would screw up the whole coordination, and that would not be ideal for a human female to have multiple pregnancies developing at one time. So that helps prevent that from occurring. Okay, and this is the remainder of that figure 27.21 in your textbook. This is a great figure to study. Make sure you understand the story that's portrayed on here. Make sure you can follow through all that information. Here's your corpus luteum, and it's producing progesterone, estrogens, and inhibin. Those are going to help maintain the uterine lining and also stimulate it to produce nourishing fluids for an embryo if it attaches. But they have negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary as well to make sure you don't keep cranking out large amounts of FSH and LH. Okay, if no fertilization takes place, no conception, then about 10 days after ovulation, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate. You'll have a sharp decrease in estrogen and progesterone levels. If the corpus luteum croaks, your estrogen and progesterone levels are going to go, they're going to plummet very quickly. That ends the blockage of FSH and LH secretion, so it ends the negative feedback. Okay, and so now your FSH and your LH levels can start to go back up, and that will allow you to go over to the beginning and start a whole new ovarian cycle. If a woman does become pregnant, though, the corpus luteum is maintained because you need that to keep secreting estrogens and especially the progesterone to maintain that endometrial lining. You don't want that sloughed off if you're pregnant. Okay, now the timing here, when you're talking about this story, it kind of sounds like, each month one little follicle goes from being a primordial to a primary to a secondary to a mature follicle, and that's not actually the case. These develop through several cycles, and but each month one follicle with a primary oocyte inside is selected to go on and develop into a mature follicle and completes that first phase of meiosis. So just keep that in mind. It's not quite the cut and dry cute story that you learn about. The key, though, is you want just one mature follicle that fully develops each month and one secondary oocyte that gets ovulated out of an ovary. Okay, lecture number 16. So that's what goes on in the ovaries. I encourage you to look at the diagrams in your textbook. I didn't include all of them here in the PowerPoint, but look in there because it actually graphs out for you the changes in the hormone levels through the ovarian cycle as well. So if you're a visual person, that'll help you visualize some of those changes that occur across the 28-day timeline. Lecture number 16, we're going to talk about how these hormones influence the menstrual cycle or the uterine cycle, the changes along the endometrium of the uterus.